Thank you, Kiera, for inviting me to speak today. Seeing so many young Canadian Ukrainians in one room brings back memories of growing up in Detroit, just across the river from Windsor. Possibly before the war, while visiting Ukraine, you traveled to the city of Drohobych and stood in awe of the magnificent and well-known tserkva of St. George, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And yet, there is a tserkva of the same period close by, the little-known tserkva of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, closed to the public for over 60 years, with very rare examples of wall paintings in the sacristy, built by the salt miners of Drohobych. Or possibly you noticed this embroidery, exhibited at the Lonsky State Prison Museum in Lviv, sewn by women prisoners after World War II, which includes their initials, cell numbers, and patterns they held dear. It's a remarkable document of Ukrainian creativity under duress, severe duress. Or possibly you visited the ancient Plesniks Preserve, just east of Lviv, and gazed upon fibulas, ancient articles of ornament used to hold capes and other garments in one place, and realized that these 7th century artifacts date to the beginnings of the Slavs in Ukraine, Ukraine's ancestors. And what of these images? Why are these images called cloud point data files of the tserkva of the Holy Trinity in Novomoskovsk, the largest wooden tserkva in Ukraine with 9 domes, very close to today's war zone, as important today as the actual house of worship from which these images are taken? We'll come to that. For Ukrainians, all the objects that I mentioned are essential documents of a nation's lived experience. From a conservator's point of view, these diverse objects reference the material nature of our work, such as wooden architecture, painted wood, archaeological metals, and particular data files. Conservation is a unique, highly technical field marrying the disciplines of science and art, and conservators address the material substance of art objects, their history, and how best to preserve them. The goal is to enable these objects to convey their meanings and stories clearly and honestly for many generations to come. This ambition today is crucial, since Ukrainian architecture and art objects are at significant daily risk due to the Russian invasion. This presentation will provide a historical context for the assault on Ukrainian material culture, focusing on my field of expertise, wooden artifacts, by introducing you to the voices of 3 little-known 20th century individuals who documented and cared for them, individuals such as Stepan Taranushenko, Pavlo Zheltovsky, and Boris Vuzhnitsky. It will conclude with present-day examples of preventive conservation regarding Ukraine's little-known Kozatsky tserkvas, and much more. Although Ukrainians have been creating architecture and art objects for centuries, the documentation of their creations blossomed in the 20th century. 2 individuals who worked together and were instrumental in this endeavor were Stepan Taranushenko and Pavlo Zheltovsky, giants of Ukrainian art history and historic preservation. Here you see Stepan Taranushenko working with a pair of dividers on an architectural drawing, and Pavlo Zheltovsky with his self-made camera bag and tripod case. Taranushenko developed a passion for art history and historic preservation and began to travel the countryside to gather items for the Central Art and Historical Museum in Kharkiv, of which he became a director in 1920. He documented his findings through sketching and photography. One example here: the wooden tserkva of the Ascension in Berezna village, Kharkiv region, from 1759, destroyed in 1929-1930. He writes, quote, "I felt the influence of architecture on me a long time ago, in my early childhood years, when I did not yet know the word architecture. It did not understand the meaning and its context. Then, on holidays, my father went to church. Sometimes he took me, the little one. And every time I visited the church, I felt some vague urges, inexplicable excitement. I don't know how to convey these feelings, yet more accurately in words, but I still remember and recall them, end quote. He hired Pawlo Żołtowski to assist him with photography. And in a 1930 letter, Pawlo Żołtowski perceptively writes, "It is necessary to collect, and collect." These are photographs of the interior wood construction of the tserkva, with the cupola, and here, the tserkva's towering iconostases, one of the finest examples of Baroque iconostases carving in Ukraine, an art form familiar to Ukrainian Christians. Typically, they have several tiers of icons with a double-door passage to the altar in the center section, called the royal doors, and a single doors on either side, called the deacon's doors. This iconostasis is unique, comprising of two separate iconostases. The central section dates the 1730s, while the flanking sections are dated earlier, to the 1650s. During the Baroque period, iconostasis construction achieved a distinctive style in Ukraine. The tiers of icons in the central portion of the iconostases became elevated, with the main form of the iconostases rising, resembling a mountain. This development formed a previous unknown impression of commanding monumentality, with many reaching the height of 20 to 22 meters, approximately 17 stories tall. The decoration of these iconostases was elaborate, evolving into dense three-dimensional carvings, often mounted into two layers, taking on the appearance of their lower sections of an open-pierced gilded curtain, rivaling the most significant carvings of the period. Here is an example of gilded and silvered carving surrounding an icon from this iconostasis, saved from destruction in the 1930s and currently in the National Museum of Ukraine collection in Kyiv. This Fall of Adam and Eve icon and the Dices icon here, just above the royal doors, are examples of some of the finest Baroque icon painting in Ukraine. During Taranushenko's and Żołtowski's last expeditions, a significant political change began in the 1920s and 30s in Moscow's party's elite. As we now well know, the Communist Party of Ukraine, then on orders from this elite, implemented the Holodomor, and in the cultural sphere, closed churches and forbade services. The destruction of the iconostases as an art form was part of this campaign. Here you see the fencing off of the iconostases before dismantling by the Communist Party members. This image documents the actual dismantling. Very preliminary statistics, numbering about 400, record how many iconostases and their icons were cut into pieces and burned. Ukrainian art historians suspect that by removing these physical, religious barriers that separate divine law in the sacristy from the laws of humans in the nave, the government could then retain the physical building, putting it into use in other ways, as we will soon see. During this period, museum staff members saved a minimal number of icons and individual carvings as examples of icon painting styles or the history of the decorative arts, such as the examples shown previously with the Fall of Adam and Eve and Dices icons. The Communist Party strictly censored any reference to the destruction of these masterpieces in Soviet publications. When World War II began, most iconostases of Eastern Ukraine were destroyed, and any surviving members were heavily damaged during the war. Only 7 18th century Baroque iconostases remain in eastern left bank Ukraine. No 17th century iconostases have survived. Public knowledge and documentation of the Holodomor and the destruction of the iconostases only became fully and widely known after Ukraine declared independence. These events eventually caught up to Stepan Taranushenko and Pawlo Żołtowski. Party members arrested both. Taranushchenko received 5 years of hard labor, serving his time in the town of Chita on the Chinese border, and Zholtovsky 3 years. They were fortunate compared to their peers. These photos are of both in exile. Having served their time, they were permitted to return to Ukraine after the Second World War, with each of them writing and documenting their previous expeditions. Taranushchenko's extensive archives of writings, drawings, and especially Zholtovsky's over 5,000 photographs and glass negatives are preserved in numerous repositories in KU and elsewhere, and an 896-page monograph of the wooden monumental architecture of Left Bank Ukraine was published posthumously in 2017 and is available on Amazon, almost 90 years after their work in the field. Today, this documentation of destroyed Ukrainian art and architecture not only gives us an insight into the breadth and depth of Ukrainian creativity, but in today's times of crisis, it empowers us to seek new ways of documenting and preserving Ukraine's cultural heritage during wartime, as we shall soon see. In a 2011 interview, Boris Vozhnetsky states, quote, "We live by the past for the future, since people who lose their past have no future." If you take our nation, Ukraine, as an example, in the 20th century, on the territory of Dnipro, Ukraine, more than 80% of our nation's cultural heritage was destroyed, including over 15,000 churches and 500,000 icons. There's not a single 17th century icon from that region in Ukraine, end quote. After World War II, the borders of Eastern Europe shifted and a part of Eastern Poland became part of the Ukrainian SSR. This change resulted in large migrations of people across new borders and led to equally significant cultural disruptions. In Western Ukraine, all Roman, Greek Catholic, and Orthodox churches and any Jewish masonry synagogues which the Nazis had not destroyed were closed during the once again anti-religion policies of the Soviet government. According to Vozhnetsky, in the Lviv Oblast alone, over 1,300 Ukrainian Orthodox and Greek Catholic churches, 500 Polish Catholic churches were closed. Instead of actively destroying them, as happened to many of them during the 1930s, the Soviet government adopted a method of purposeful neglect. This contemporary image is of the Panteleimon Church in Shevchenkove in the Halych region, the oldest church in Western Ukraine dating to the 12th century. In contrast, this image from the 1970s documents its use as a storage facility, with a pile of grain on the floor, mounds of corn in the back, and tobacco leaves strung up for drying. This contemporary image demonstrates the transformation of the 16th century Church of St. Nicholas in Zolochiu from a sacred place of worship to a museum of atheism. These sacred structures would have been filled with religious objects and artifacts. After the authorities shuttered their buildings, many residents saved these objects from destruction, hiding them away for decades underneath the floorboards, in the attics, in the haylofts, in the caves. Many were returned to the houses of worship once Ukraine declared independence in 1991. On the other hand, parishioners of Roman Catholic churches had migrated over the new borders, abandoning their large polychrome wood sculptures to an uncertain fate. During the early 1960s, Boris Vozhnetsky began his work as a young assistant director of the Lviv Art Gallery. With a Soviet War medal and degrees in art history from the Leningrad School of Art, Vozhnetsky could assert his authority over the Soviet bureaucracy. When he saw the plenitude of objects being actively destroyed or left to slowly deteriorate, he dedicated himself to saving these objects from destruction. He traveled throughout the towns and villages of Western Ukraine on his motorcycle, with his museum team behind him in a truck, returning with precious cultural artifacts which today are recognized far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Wojnicki recalled one expedition in the 1960s to a church in the small town of Horodovenka, where he was told of many polychrome sculptures by Johann Georg Pinzel. It was a timely discovery, since these works of Pinzel, who was soon to be recognized as a Baroque carving master, were at risk. Upon arrival, he encountered the sawing of Pinzel's masterpieces for firewood. He immediately rescued 5 severely damaged examples of Pinzel's masterpieces without limbs, heads, or polychromy. 13 had already been destroyed. One saved example is here, St. Joseph. In contrast, this image exemplifies the restored polychromy pair, Abraham sacrificing Isaac, circa 1760, at the Johann Pinzel Museum in Lviv. These discoveries attracted attention, and the Louvre Museum organized an exhibition of Pinzel's work in 2012. Here's a personal photograph I took in 2018 in the storage facilities of the former Capuchin monastery in Olesko, holding over 1,200 Renaissance and Baroque sculptures, a direct result of his rescue efforts, all awaiting conservation. Despite numerous obstacles, Wojnicki organized countless exhibitions and created 15 museums. He passed away in 2012, recognized with many honors and awards. Here he is, giving a tour in his rumpled suit of the Podhorodetsky Palace and Fortification with Ukraine's highest honor pinned to his lapel, Hero of Ukraine. The legacy of the individuals I mentioned is today's Ukraine's documented, preserved, restored, or rebuilt wooden artifacts and architecture. These cultural artifacts were and are an integral aspect of Ukrainians' process of discovering their heritage and building a nation. These processes also pose an existential threat to Russia's imperial ambitions, which is why there are so many UNESCO documented examples of damaged cultural heritage sites in Ukraine. In response, Ukrainians and their supporters in the West have embarked on numerous initiatives to protect and document Ukraine's cultural heritage and plan for the future. This portion of my talk will highlight examples of one such initiative I initiated and facilitated, working with the Red Arch Cultural Heritage Law and Policy Research Foundation and the Lviv Polytechnic National University faculty. Our goal was to digitally scan 11 historically and culturally significant Kozatsky tserkvas of eastern Ukraine, little known in the West. Ukraine has an extensive collection of documented wooden tserkvas, numbering over 2,300 in 2012, and the Kozatsky tserkvas make up a significant subset. The purpose was to create a very accurate record utilizing a Leica digital architectural scanner, which gathers and compiles digital cloud points, an image I depicted at the beginning of my presentation. These digital cloud points can be transformed into detailed architectural drawings, accurate to within 3 millimeters, and utilized in the restoration and rebuilding process should these religious structures become damaged or destroyed during wartime activity. One example of the journey to eastern Ukraine is the Tsarkov of the Holy Trinity in Novomoskovsk, formerly Novoselytsia, one of the crown jewels of Ukrainian wooden architecture. It is Ukraine's largest wooden house of worship with 9 domes and was built in 1778 by Yakim Pogrebnyak and the remnants of the Cossack community of the Zaporizhzhia Sich, which Empress Catherine II destroyed 3 years earlier. It is the only known surviving example of this 9-domed architectural art style left in Ukraine. The original name of the Cossack settlement, Novoselytsia, was changed in the 19th century by Russian authorities to erase the history of its Cossack founding. Here is the scanner in action and the type of images it produces. This image depicts the interior details of the central dome painted ceiling. In a recent conversation with Svetlana Olyanina, historian of Ukrainian iconostases, she recalls a childhood memory of visiting the tserkva of the Holy Trinity in the early 1980s. At that time, it was bereft of an iconostasis, being a part of the Dnipropetrovsk Museum complex. Later, about the time Ukraine declared independence, the current iconostasis was installed. Yet here is the image of the iconostasis taken by Taranushenko in 1928, before it was destroyed in the 1930s. I apologize for the quality of this image, which was taken from a book. An actual photo does exist. However, the archives are closed, so I was not able to access it. As you can see, the original iconostasis is stylistically different from the current one, being made in the Ukrainian Rococo style, with considerably larger painted icons set against a light-colored architectural form. No attempt was made to recreate the currently installed iconostases from original existing photographs. This situation highlights the trade in iconostases, sections, and icons since independence, resulting in some contemporary installations seeming to have a stylistic unity from a distance, but upon closer inspection, revealing a very different reality. A good example is here. The current iconostases in the Church of St. Clement Sheptytsky in Lviv, in the former 17th century Reformed Franciscan Church of St. Casimir. The top section is an 18th century iconostasis from the Tserkva of the Nativity in Krupsk. However, the overall construction consists of 4 separate iconostasis sections. This installation leads to thought-provoking questions regarding Western concepts of originality, and in my field of conservation, the ethical concept of the integrity of the object. A second example of a Cossack tserkva is the tserkva of St. George in Sendiu, also from Chernihiv. Although constructed between 1705 and 1715, this tserkva lost many of its original features during the rebuilding process in the late 18th century and afterwards. This design is rare in Ukrainian wooden tserkva construction, similar to the earlier mentioned and destroyed tserkva of the Ascension in Berezna village. In this image on the left, you see the main entrance doors with carved moldings and hand-wrought hinges. The image on the right highlights an interesting structural detail. All tserkvas would have required periodic maintenance, from relatively straightforward procedures such as replacing the degraded roof shakes called gonte, to much more involved procedures such as replacing the degraded lower horizontal courses of timbers. This last procedure would have involved the whole community, since the tserkva would have needed to be raised off its stone foundations for their replacement. The image on the right documents how the lowest timber course would have been scribed to fit the individual stone foundation. The foundation stone was then carved and painted with the year of maintenance, 1892. Also visible are the irregular vertical tool marks, indicating that the timber was cut by hand in a pit saw before sawing timbers became widely mechanized with machines. This tserkva lacks an iconostasis. However, the interior has numerous examples of icons, banners, and extensive use of embroidery to frame the icons, some of which are local folk icons. The embroidery on the right is distinctive. It has the initials of the maker and the date, echoing the Lonsky prison embroidery shown earlier, communicating a sense of self-worth and local community engagement, but under vastly different circumstances and intentions. Another Cossack example is the tserkva of the Intercession in Sinyuka, also from Chernihiv. Originally dated to 1706, it features a Baroque roof structure from a rebuilding campaign in 1775. This small tserkva exhibits 3 sections and 3 domes, a rare example of wooden architecture preserved almost in its original form. The octagon central dome features rare cross-shaped windows. The interior photographs highlight the undisturbed interior wall paintings, as seen in Stepan Terenushenko's image from 1930 to today. The commanding iconostasis is in a classical style, also dated to Ukraine's independence. Even though not authentic to this object, the tserkva, it lends a feeling of monumentality, achieved by a proportionately tall interior height in contrast to the relatively small floor plan. The last example is the tserkva of the Holy Trinity, dated 1763 from Stepanivka, also from the Chernihiv region. Like the Sinyuka tserkva, this tserkva has a single-story construction characteristic of this region. The small cupolas, finials above the narthex and the sanctuary are distinctive features. The interior is distinctive for its circular wall paintings of the evangelists in the upper corners. However, unlike the tserkva of St. George in Sendiu, which completely lacks an iconostasis, here we have a straightforward painted wooden wall and doors acting as a placeholder for an iconostasis, decorated with embroidery which also adorns the tserkva interior. A section of the original Baroque-style royal doors in the right image was photographed by Pavlo Zholtovsky in 1932 at the height of the iconostasis destructions. As with the previous examples of the Berezna village iconostases, they attest to the high quality of the artistic achievement of the past, with masterfully carved foliage and an open pierced center column. Notice the missing painted imagery in the center paneled sections. During this period, if not destroyed outright, iconostasis sections would have been stored in unfavorable condition, leading to the delamination of sensitive painting and gilding surfaces. In this image, even though the embroidery appears minimally damaged, other objects, such as the religious paintings, folk icons, and banners, are examples of severe neglect and require immediate conservation treatment. Nonetheless, even in this condition, these objects, textiles, painting on wood, and cloth, partially heal the wounds of the iconostasis theft and destruction. They document the living vernacular culture of the tserkva, attesting to its collective spiritual knowledge, beliefs, practices, and memory. The images of tserkvas in eastern Ukraine and the existing polychrome sculptures in Olesko are but a few examples of Ukraine's cultural heritage that require conservation and historic preservation. The initial successes of scanning 11 tserkvas has been expanded to include 25 for 2024, and 2 other initiatives are also in progress: the sharing of conservation knowledge and the upgrading of conservation analytical instrumentation. For example, working with the translator and editors, my Ukrainian language version of colleague Michelle Merinkolo's 300-page Getty publication, The Conservation of Medieval Polychrome Sculpture, is now complete and in its final editing stages. It will significantly enhance the conservation of Ukraine's icons, iconostases, and polychrome sculptures. A second initiative is to create a regional art conservation laboratory in Lviv with up-to-date instrumentation so that Ukrainian works of art can be conserved and exhibited in foreign museums, and research papers can be presented at international conferences. The microscope on the right exemplifies the outdated Soviet-era instrumentation of 1962 with which Ukrainian conservation scientists currently work. Today, as Ukraine fights for its very existence, its heritage of material objects imbued with the aura of the lives they've inspired carries the history and memory of Ukraine. Your assistance is required for them to continue to do so. My colleagues in Ukraine would be thrilled to hear your voices and would welcome your input and support. I would like to formally acknowledge the efforts of the numerous individuals who contributed to this presentation and this talk. It would not have been possible without them, especially in today's circumstances when Ukrainian archives are closed, the internet service is sporadic, and many of my colleagues are displaced throughout the world as refugees. And I'd like to close on an optimistic note with a selfie of 2 members of the scanning team, conservation architects Igor Bokolo, PhD, and Mariana Kaplinska, PhD, as examples of Ukraine's future. Дякую за увагу.